You're listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network, and now it's time for the Paranormal Peep Show.
Was that the phrase was Beatrice belief, and that it was in the code that they used in their act. And then Ford gave it in the code that they used in their act. He gave the keywords.
She comes to me and she says, "There's somebody standing right behind you with his hands on his shoulders, and he's telling me his name is George." So I shook my head. I don't know who that is. And she closes her eyes. She said, "He's telling me he's a former colleague, and he passed into spirit about 20 years ago, and he died of a blood-related disease, and he's very happy that you have a job now that you like. He said he's been around you in your office, and he knows you like your job." Well, it just didn't ring any bell with me at the time. Yeah, and I'm sorry, I don't know who that is. And all of a sudden, about an hour after, no, not even an hour, maybe 20 minutes after I left the place, it dawned on me that this person, George, was somebody who worked with me in 1979. Wyman was a scholar in Confucius literature, so he started quizzing Confucius on some of his writings, and he got accurate responses. There was one thing that had confused scholars for a number of years, and Wyman asked about it, and the confusion was explained to him why something was mistranslated.
Hi, my name's Neil Ward and you're watching the Paranormal Peep Show. And if you caught us on the episode last month, we were talking to Stephen Sakellarios and Ben Emlyn Jones, and we were covering the film The Astral City, talking about aspects of the afterlife. And Stephen has agreed to rejoin us again this month because he brought up an interesting interview that he had actually previously conducted a number of years ago, talking to a gentleman by the name of Michael Tymn. So Stephen, welcome back first of all. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on again.
Well, it's great that you could spare the time just to give us this brief introduction to this very interesting interview that I have listened to. Now, you made this interview a number of years ago. What was you doing? You was doing a whole series of podcasts at the time, weren't you?
Yeah, I called it Metaphysical Explorations. I did it through Blog Talk Radio and had a number of good guests. The only thing was that I didn't know how to build an audience. So I had a very small audience and a nice program, but I think I stopped it after about 10 episodes.
Well, I took a listen. Thank you for digging it out of your files. It was remaining in the archive somewhere, but I've taken that audio and I polished it up using Adobe Podcast Enhancer. Although I have to say it was actually a very good quality audio anyway, but I always like to see if I can improve these things somewhat. So you were talking and you alluded to this gentleman, Michael Tymn, in our previous episode that you had interviewed. So can you remind us about who Michael Tymn is and what is this particular episode that we're going to play to everyone this evening? What is it about?
Well, he's an expert on mediumship and in particular the history of mediumship. And this is something that I wanted my audience to get a grasp on, was just how much history there is in this field, that there's been serious scientific work, rigorous work done for like 150 years or more on this subject, and people don't really have the background. So since he was an expert and I really wasn't on that particular area, I wanted to bring him on and just ask him to give us an overview, historical overview, which he did a beautiful job on, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he mentions, I think he said he was a lapsed Catholic or something, but he started to become interested in this kind of field. It's funny how these people cross over, even at a later stage in his life. He wasn't doing it from year dot. He actually was, I think it was in his 50s or something when he started to look into this, maybe 60s. So what particular parts of the interview changed your kind of opinion of things? Was there anything that kind of convinced you that maybe mediumship was really real, that he spoke about?
Well, I'm afraid I was pretty much convinced at that point, but again,
Right.
I didn't really know the history, and I wanted people to understand that this has a rich history, and it's not just something that started, 10 or 20 years ago. So, I mean, I really understood it, that it was real from a long time ago.
And why do you think that there's such a rich history of it from way back then. And although we got a history of it today, it seems to be that the things that Michael Tymn is talking about, and yourself in the interview, there seems to be an awful lot of really good physical mediumship that these researchers looked into, like William Crookes and Oliver Lodge and people like that. They tested out Daniel Dunglas Home and those kinds of people. And yet today, we seem to be severely lacking on those kind of wonderful mediums. We've got your John Edwards and your people like that can do clairvoyance, but on the general front of things, it's like the physical mediumship, these wondrous things that we've heard of in the past, seem to be sort of pretty much non-existent. I mean, there's a few people doing it, but either they're keeping a closely guarded secret and not many people are aware of it. But you think in this day and age, the 21st century, with the internet and chat rooms and all sorts of things, that we should be hearing a lot about these things, but it seems notoriously quiet on that.
Well, of course, now we're at the point of AI. So there's almost nothing photographic that you could do that anybody could trust. So, that's a serious problem. Mental mediumship is almost the only thing that would work now, because in mental mediumship, the medium can get things that nobody knew. In my case, that happened. I didn't know it. The medium didn't know it. I was able to prove it in the historical record some years later. Therefore, it couldn't possibly have been ESP, but it was validated, and that can happen in mental mediumship. So the medium can get some little detail that the person has never told anyone, at all. And that's still validation even in the era of AI, because AI can't get that. In physical mediumship now, unless you happen to be there, if you're there watching it with your own eyes, that's one thing, but nobody else would have any reason to believe it. So that's one issue. I don't know why the other side might have said, well, this is hopeless. It's a huge amount of energy. Maybe it's risky. It's risky to the medium. It may be risky in other ways. And they said, humanity isn't getting it. So there's no point in going to this kind of trouble. But the other thing that occurs to me is that this research was done back in the early days of science. So these people were applying the scientific method, and they weren't materialistic. They didn't come from a materialistic culture, so they weren't shy about non-materialistic things. So they applied the same scientific method to these questions that they would have applied to geology or paleontology or anything else, And nowadays, of course, we don't have that problem. I mean, we don't have that opportunity, because most of science is secular and materialistic, and so the best scientists aren't looking at this particular problem. If all the scientists were still open-minded about non-material reality, then you might have more.
It seems like there was an absolute treasure trove of people to study back then. And even the people like Sir William Crookes had problems of trying to convince his peers to come down to his own laboratory, under laboratory conditions, which is what they always demanded. And he said, well, look, I've got them under laboratory conditions. Come and see for yourself this. And they all refused to come and see him. And it seems like they're trying to crack a hard nut. And they're don't bother me with the facts, is what Stanton Friedman used to say. I'm not interested in looking at the facts. My mind is made up, type of thing. And that's the same with the mediumship. And I think now they've got an even harder nut to crack, because like it says, AI and things like that. And people will just not be swayed to come and investigate these things.
Refusing to look is not scientific. That is not a scientific attitude. That is not science.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we better roll the tape, as they say, because I think what people probably had enough of us moaning about it. Let's hear what you said. And when was this recording made, Stephen?
Well, according to the file date, it looks like it was about 2013. I don't actually remember,
Right.
but I think we're talking about that long ago.
Okay, so let's roll the tape and listen to Stephen talking to Michael Tymn about the mediums of yesteryear.
Welcome to Metaphysical Explorations. I'm your host, Stephen Sakellarios. We're not concerned with any kind of hype on this show, and whether or not our guests are famous is incidental.
We're looking for the truth. And I've found that each person in his life and through the process of living, often through intense suffering, has brought up from the mine of his or her experience some jewel of truth. I don't interrogate my guest from a list of questions. I want to enter into a real conversation and give him or her the opportunity to share that jewel with us. Welcome to Metaphysical Explorations. This is Stephen Sakellarios. This evening we're going to be talking to Michael Tymn. He is a 1958 graduate of the School of Journalism at San Jose State University. He's contributed more than 1,600 articles to some 45 newspapers, magazines, journals, and books over the past 50 years. While most of his articles have dealt with the subjects from the sports arena, Michael has done business, travel, metaphysical, and human interest features. He won the 1999 Robert H. Ashby Memorial Award, given by the Academy of Religion and Psychical Research, for his essay on dying, death, and after death. Mike's books include The Articulate Dead, Running on Third Wind, The Afterlife Revealed, The Afterlife Explorers, Transcending the Titanic, and Resurrecting Leonora Piper. He currently serves as editor of The Searchlight, a quarterly publication for the Academy for Spiritual and Consciousness Studies, of which he is vice president. His metaphysical articles have appeared in a variety of publications. Mike, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thank you very much for having me on, Steve. Appreciate it. So we have one quick correction. My vice presidency term lapsed on June the 1st, so I'm no longer vice president. I'm still editor of The Searchlight and editor of the Academy's Journal.
Okay, so you're still involved with them, but you're not serving as president. Yeah, right. Now, here's my question. You're actually our second person who got started in sports and moved on to metaphysics and spiritual areas, but how did that happen? How did you get from that one area to the other?
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's a real relationship. I was a distance runner for many years, and as I say, I'm not sure that's related to my pursuit of spiritual truth, but somewhere around age 50, I just felt a need to get back to some religion. I grew up a Catholic and was a Catholic until around age 40, and then had no religion of any kind for about 10 or 15 years. And then somewhere around age 50, I decided I had to find something. And I happened to be in the train station in Washington, D.C., and came upon a book by Edgar Cayce and read that on a train ride down to Atlanta, Georgia. And that sort of got me going in spiritual matters. I read more of Cayce and started reading other books on reincarnation, and then I went from reincarnation to near-death experiences, and from near-death experiences to mediumship, and I'm still in all of those areas. Mediumship is my primary interest right now, but all aspects of spirituality that involve survival of consciousness or an afterlife are my primary interests.
Right, like I've focused on reincarnation and you're focusing on mediumship, but it all ties together.
Right.
Yeah. Let's start out. What is your assessment of mediumship at this point? How long have you studied that particular area now?
Well, for the last 20 or 25 years, but really since I retired in 2002, that I really got into it, started writing books on it. So it's the last 10 or 11 years that I really got serious about it. So my assessment, when you say my assessment, what we see as mediumship today, the type of clairvoyance that you see on television with John Edward and I can't think of her name, the New Jersey medium, and we used to see with James Van Praagh. That's not the type of mediumship. I'm not even sure you'd call that mediumship. The type of Leonora Piper, who I wrote my last book about, there was a totally different type of mediumship there. I think, clairvoyance, bring through messages from the dead, but it's a different type of mediumship.
You're really talking like Leonora Piper and Edgar Cayce. They really went into a deep trance and then they were not there, basically.
Right. their spirit bodies, in effect, left their bodies and, were taken over by a spirit, and the communication was coming from another spirit.
Right. So that's really a different process.
Right, right.
So what I want to do, if you're amenable here, is to really delve into the history, because I've been studying the 19th century, and it seems like a rich time from the spiritual point of view and the psychical point of view. I like to talk about the history of psychical research and spiritualism in the 19th century. So I'm going to leave it open to you as to where to pick it up.
Okay, well, I have a little timeline that I have in one of my books that I copied out here, and everything seems to have begun on March 31st, 1848, as you know, which was the when the Fox family in Hydesville, New York, began hearing raps in their house. So that John Fox had two daughters, Margaret and Kate, who lived at home, and they heard these raps coming through, and they somehow figured out that they could communicate with these raps. So they'd get, 3 raps for a yes and 2 raps for a no, or there'd be 5 raps, might indicate an E, and, 3 raps, a C, and so forth. Anyway, they began communicating with the raps, and that was the breakthrough that the spirit world apparently had been trying to make for a number of years. There are indications that they were trying to get through as early as 1820 or so, but nobody seemed to know what these raps were or made any effort to communicate with them. So March 31st, 1848 is the big breakthrough with Fox family.
Wasn't there an evidential aspect to that, the body in the basement or something, or am I confused?
Right. They figured out through these raps that the person who was communicating had lived there about 5 years earlier and had been murdered and buried underneath the house. And they did some digging and found some bones. They didn't get a complete body. Apparently there was some underwater stream that interfered with their digging, but somewhere around 1905, about 50 years later, they did some more digging to find a complete skeleton under the house.
So the chances of that, I mean, if I just decided and started imagining that I was hearing raps and decided to dig under my house, the chances I'd find a human skeleton under there are pretty slight, right? I mean, so we're starting out with a pretty strong evidential result at the very beginning.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, but if you have any skeptics listening, the skeptical view is that this was all made up. There are no bones underneath, and how do you go back in time and prove that there were bones? Or actually,
They just deny it happened altogether.
right,
No bones about it, in other words.
right.
Yeah, so to speak. All right. So what happens next?
Well, the first psychical researcher was really John Edmonds, who was the Chief Justice of the New York State Supreme Court. He had just lost his wife sometime around at the end of 1850, and was persuaded by a couple of his friends to go to a medium, and he thought it was all bunk, but he said, okay, I'll go anyway. And he was very much impressed with his first sitting with a medium and decided to investigate other mediums. So he, over the next 2 years, he investigated, I think, somewhere between 30 and 40 mediums, and came to the conclusion that mediumship was a reality. And he authored the first book on spiritualism in 1853, I think it was, with John Dexter, who was a physician, co-authored the book. And that was really the beginning of psychical research. The official beginning wasn't until 1882, which we'll jump down to later, but January 1851 is when Judge Edmonds began his investigation of mediums. And so it went on from there with a number of different educated people.
Now, let me do this for a second. Did Judge Edmonds, did he attempt to institute any controls at that point?
He doesn't really, spell it out in his books, but it's sort of implied. I mean, as far as scientific, the scientific aspects of it, there's a lot of unanswered questions as to what,
It's an early effort where he didn't try to prevent every possible alternative explanation, right, or a laboratory setting or anything. He just went out and checked them out. Was there anything that he reported that was particularly evidential that you recall?
There's quite a bit, but off the top of my head, I can't. Don't know.
right.
I can't relate those story.
Yeah, but there were things that seemed quite convincing to him, in other words.
Yeah, but so much of what came through was not evidential mediumship so much as it was what's called spiraling mediumship. Basically there are two types of mediumship: evidential and spiraling, and the spiraling mediumship has to do with knowledge and wisdom coming through, actually things that can't be verified. And you mentioned at some point that Alexander what's his name escaping Davis.
Yeah, Andrew Jackson Davis.
Andrew Jackson Davis. I mean, he was more of a spiraling medium,
And he was uneducated. Yeah, he was uneducated when he started. There's no way that, that I can see that he could have come out with the kind of things he came out with based on his IQ level. Yeah.
but
So that's spiraling.
yeah, there's not very much in the way of evidential mediumship. There may very well have been some evidential things coming through him, but they're not really documented.
He may not have been that interested in those things. He may have been more interested in a higher wisdom that was coming through. And that depends on the quality of the person that's on the other side, right? I mean, you can have the guy that used to run the bar down the street. If he died, you're not going to maybe get the highest philosophy out of him. Right. Okay. Yeah. So, okay. So what happens after Judge?
Okay, 1851, the New York Circle, which was an association of prominent men and women, including Judge Edmonds, was formed and began doing some additional investigation. Their first official meeting took place on November the 14th, 1851, and then over in England, 1851 also, the Ghost Society was formed in Cambridge, and one of their founders was Edward White Benson, later Archbishop of Canterbury. 1852, a Harvard University delegation, including poet William Cullen Bryant, and let's see, names were Bliss, Edwards, and Wells, studied physical mediumship of Daniel Dunglas Home, and concluded that he was a modern wonder.
Yeah, let's spend time on him before we get there. No, before we get off it, let's spend some time on him. And the other thing I wanted to mention is these are very intelligent, highly credentialed people that are studying these things. These are not just your average Joe Blow here, right? I mean, that seems to be a pattern all the way through. As we get further on, we'll see there's some outstanding people with scientific records and everything else. So I think that should be kept in mind. But tell us about, is it pronounced Hume, because it's spelled H-O-M-E, but is it?
Yeah, actually, it's pronounced Hoom, Hoom, although it depends on whether you're in England or Scotland. In England, they call it Hume. In Scotland, they call it Hoom. Americans call it Home, H-O-M-E, but Hoom, I'm told, is the correct pronunciation. He was born in Scotland, came to the United States as a young boy, and then grew up in the United States, and then moved back to Europe and mostly England for the latter part of his life. But he was probably the first great physical medium, maybe the best physical medium ever.
And what is physical mediumship, for those who don't know?
But it's manifestations of physical phenomena. I mean, physical mediumship usually involves ectoplasm, which is something that's given off by the medium that allows something to materialize. And in full materialization, you'll get a full spirit materialization where you can actually see the spirit there. Most mediums don't have that strength or don't have that power or whatever, so all you'll get is partial materializations, maybe a hand or whatever, maybe just a face, not a full body.
Right.
Horner seems to have been a pretty powerful medium, but mostly what the people saw around him were hands manipulating things. One of the things that one of the phenomena that occurred often with him was an accordion floating around the room, playing with hands on the accordion, and
which is pretty hard to fake, right? I mean,
right,
yeah.
And Sir William Crookes, who was one of the very distinguished scientists of that era, sat with whom on 31 occasions, actually. He set out to debunk him. He thought he was a fraud, and figured after 1 or 2 sittings he'd prove that he was a fraud, but after 31 sittings he said, no, he's for real, he's genuine. But of course, Crookes was then criticized by the scientific establishment and had to retreat and go back to orthodox science and forget about investigating spiritual matters until he retired about 25 years later. But he observed, Crookes wrote a number of reports on his observations with Hume, and besides quoting accordions, you saw one of the very interesting reports was they were sitting around a table, and one of the people sitting on one side of the table was lifted out of his chair, floated across the table, a dining room table, and then dropped on the other side. Crookes also saw Hume levitated himself on 3 occasions. And I say, people tend to say, well, those people who know about him say, well, Hume could levitate. He couldn't levitate. He was levitated. I just say what levitation involves is the spirits picking up the person. He doesn't pick himself up. He's been picked up by invisible hands or whatever and levitated. And Crookes's wife, Ellen, I think was her name, she was sitting in a chair, and her chair started floating with her in it. So
That would tend to convince you if it happened to you personally.
right.
Yeah.
And besides Crookes, also Alfred Russel Wallace, who was co-originator of the natural selection theory of evolution with Charles Darwin, was present on one occasion, and he observed a table levitating and got down on his hands and knees with Crookes, and they're running their hands under the legs of the table, trying to figure out if there were invisible wires there or what. But there was no question in their minds that Hume was for real.
What was the public reaction to him? Do you know?
Well, the scientific I don't think, that at that time, it was covered by the media. There wasn't that much of a media at that time, but Crookes reported to his scientific colleagues, and they just said, you've been tricked somehow. We don't know how, but you've been tricked. And so he didn't get very far as he invited a number of other of his scientific colleagues to, come and attend. Most of the sittings were at his house. So as Crookes pointed out, I mean, if this guy was a fraud, and how did he,
how do you rig all those wires in his house?
how do you rig up all those wires at his house when there's no opportunity? If he had gone to Hume's home or his apartment or whatever, then that's one thing. But these were all at Crookes's house. But his colleagues just brushed it off and said, no, it's not worthy of us. It's clearly a fraud, fraudulent, and we don't want to see it.
Ostrich.
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I've read some fascinating things about him. He wrote his own book, didn't he? I don't remember the title of it now, but he wrote a book himself. I haven't had a chance. You can download it for free, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet.
Yeah, I've got it on my list. I got it in my library here. I can't remember the name of it, but I think he's got 2 books. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So these are all the things that people listening can look into for themselves. We can't go visit him anymore, but we can certainly read about him.
Right.
Yeah. Now, okay. So let's see who else was on the scene.
Okay. Dr. Robert Hare, he was a University of Pennsylvania chemistry professor, and a renowned inventor. This is during the 1850s. He also started with the intention of debunking mediums, but after a year or so of visiting something like 25 mediums, he also, like Judge Edmonds, came to the conclusion that they're real. In fact, he became a medium himself after several years, and he wrote a book called Experimental Investigation of the Spirit Manifestations, which is sort of a classic in the field. But here again, even though he was well respected before he began his investigation, his colleagues felt he'd been tricked somehow and refused to to accept what he had to say.
So it's sort of like, I mean, I get a kind of a vision of a door where if you get close enough and you get sucked through, you never come back. But if you don't let yourself get close to the door, you're okay, kind of. So
Yeah, right.
no matter, and this must be a pattern that people are skeptical when they first. I mean, this is the second person so far, but I think this is not uncommon, right? That a skeptical person, if they're open-minded, if they really take the time to seriously look into it, they mostly get convinced.
I think so, yeah. But there were so many frauds that those people who hadn't witnessed it firsthand were inclined to believe that they were all frauds.
So are there any frauds that we can talk about? Any like famous frauds?
Yeah, I haven't really paid much attention to the frauds. There's a number of them that have been written off as frauds that indications are that they were fraudulent. One of the examples is Eusapia Palladino. You probably heard of her. She was a famous Italian medium, a physical medium, and she was supposedly debunked by a number of researchers, but there were just as many researchers who said that she was genuine. So when you look at all the material on Palladino, you don't know what to believe after a while. But when you really dig into it, you realize that what is taken as fraud by a lot of the investigators was just things they didn't understand. For Palladino would, in fact, grow an ectoplasmic arm that would reach out and touch people. And so the investigators, would assume that this was her hand touching them rather than the ectoplasmic hand. And, I should go back and say that most of this takes place in the dark because ectoplasm is sensitive to light. Of course, that the skeptics will say, well, yeah, that's very convenient that ectoplasm is sensitive to light, but same as photographic plates. Why can't they be
Right.
produced in the light?
So now, is it possible that there could be a mix? I mean, I'm imagining a situation where if a person is, earning their living and they have some genuine ability, but maybe it's not every time, so they've got a client that's, a wealthy client and they're just not getting anything. So wouldn't there be tremendous pressure to say, well, I'll just fake it this one time because, so is it possible that there could.
Yeah, that was another answer. Palladino probably did cheat on a number of occasions because she was expected to produce on every occasion, and she was an uneducated woman and felt she had to make all these people around her happy. So at times when nothing happened, she would make things happen.
Right.
They were very minor things, but the researchers assumed that because this little fraud was taking place here and there, that everything was fraud.
Right.
And another aspect of this is that for these mediums for the phenomena to really come through, it was well established that there had to be harmony, a certain harmony. That's why they sang, they prayed, and everything else to get the right vibes or whatever it took to get the phenomena to come through. Sometimes they'd sit there for an hour and nothing would happen. Then all of a sudden, when the conditions were right, things would start happening.
So it's almost like quantum physics where the observer is affecting the experimental results.
Right.
Yeah.
So and many times there nothing happened. They would sit there. Hamlin Garland was one of the well-known investigators of the early 1900s, and he reported sitting for 3 hours at a time without anything happening, and yet on other occasions, it would start after 15 or 20 minutes. Yeah, you wonder how many people would sit for 3 hours. I mean, I would give up after 10 or 15 minutes, I think, and most people probably would too. I bought a Ouija board about 5 years ago just to see if anything would happen, and nothing happened after 10 minutes. So I gave up and hadn't pulled it out since.
All right. Well, some of these circles that said I read about, I did some reading in preparation today, and I don't remember the times, but they'd sit for like weeks or months, and nothing would happen. And finally, after 7 months, something started happening. But as you say, who has that kind of patience to keep sitting there for time? Yeah. So
Right. Speaking of patience, I just wrote a magazine article for Atlantis Rising on Patience Worth. I don't know if you're familiar with Patience Worth or not.
the name rings a bell, but go ahead.
Yeah, well,
Refresh my memory.
July 6th of this year marks 100 years since Patience Worth announced herself. What happened there is that 3 St. Louis, Missouri women were sitting around playing with the Ouija board while their husbands played pinochle in the next room, and they began getting some messages that some indication that somebody was trying to communicate with them, but it really wasn't much. And it sat there for 9 months, and one of the women, her name was Pearl Curran, and she wasn't really interested. She said, "Let's go on to something else. This is getting pretty tiresome." As it turned out, she was the real medium, and after 9 months, they got a message. "Many moons ago I lived, Patience Worth my name." And so that was the beginning of it all on July 6th, 1913. And for over the next 24 years, Patience Worth dictated, I forget how many million words, but there were 7 books and numerous poems and essays and so forth. She was compared with Shakespeare and Chaucer and a number of other Spencer, a number of other well-known authors, and
This was the spiraling type, but it was so good that it becomes evidential in a sense.
yeah, it's evidential in the fact that Pearl Curran had an 8th grade education, was never exposed to any of the things that came through. She was investigated by a number of scientists and scholars of the time, and they all concluded, well, it must be her secondary personality. She's unaware of this alter ego in her, and so it's coming through the alter ego. But none of them explain how all this wisdom and knowledge got into her subconscious. I mean, today
One would say that would become a marketable course if everybody had a really smart alter ego. We need to get that thing out.
yeah. Today they probably say that there's a playpen next to the television set or something, and while the mother was tending to her chores, the baby was exposed to the History Channel or something like that, and listening to all this stuff and absorbed in her subconscious.
Not enough.
Yeah. But back in actually late 1800s, when Pearl was growing up, they didn't have any of that. There were no.
Maybe they lived next to a church and she heard the sermons in the womb.
Right.
Yeah. The skeptical arguments get pretty silly to me. It's on the level of I've studied psychology. I have a degree in counseling, and in transactional analysis, they talk about the little professor. And the little professor is the boy that says the dog ate my homework, or the crumb are all over his mouth, and he says I didn't eat the cookie. If a lot of these skeptical arguments strike me as the little professor. Right. Yeah. Anyway. Now, you've written a book, and I read as much of it as I could get into on Amazon today, called Resurrecting Leonora Piper. Let's talk about Leonora Piper.
Okay. She was a Boston housewife who in 1884, she discovered that she had a mediumistic ability. She was attending a sitting with a healing medium when all of a sudden she fell into a trance and spirits began communicating with her or through her with others in the room. She didn't know what was going on when she woke up. She was told what happened. Anyway, over the next next year or so, she developed as a trance medium. William James, who was professor of psychology at Harvard at the time, heard about her through his mother-in-law and sister-in-law. So at that time, he had just formed the American Society for Psychical Research, which was affiliated with the Society for Psychical Research in London. And so he decided Leonora would be a good subject to investigate. He sat with her about a dozen times, became convinced that something was going on, something supernatural was going on, that she was not a fraud. But again, because of the scientific skepticism involved, he was reluctant to say
Come out of the closet.
say it was spirits. So that he actually they ended up hiring Dr. Richard Hodgson from England to come over and sit with Leonora for on the average of 3 times a week over the next 24 years, I think it was. So Hodgson had a number of hundreds of sittings with Leonora Piper. Initially, he was also a skeptic. He was out to debunk her. He thought that she was definitely a fraud, but within a matter of months, he was a believer. But what they believed at that time again was that it was somehow her secondary personality had the ability to telepathically get messages from the sitters. And so that they didn't see it as spirits, they saw it as telepathy.
And did he get information that nobody knew, that the sitter didn't know, that the observer didn't know?
Well, that's what I was just going to get to. When information came through that the sitter didn't even know, they expanded the theory to what today is called super psi. They had other names for it, but they said that that somehow the medium could dig into some cosmic reservoir someplace and come up with all this information, or could read the minds of anybody in the world and feed it back, which was seemingly a lot more fantastic than the spirit theory. But
Super PSI is like I didn't eat the cookie. A monster came and put the crumbs on my mouth.
That's what it amounts to. Yeah.
You've been the first explanation didn't work, and so you can't come up with something bigger. I'm sorry. It really amuses me. I don't know, but apparently it doesn't amuse a lot of people. Anyway, so she got information that nobody knew, and then they had to come up with another explanation besides her formal telepathy.
Yeah. And the thing,
Can you think of some of the things? I'm sorry. I mean, yeah. At some point, some examples of things that she came up with. Doesn't have to be right this minute.
Yeah, no, well, actually, what convinced Hodgson, for about the first 3 years that Hodgson investigated her, he was convinced that it was telepathy of some kind. There's no question that she was not a fraud. He felt she was a very sincere and honest woman. She went into a trance, and her what they saw as her secondary personality was tapping into this cosmic reservoir someplace and coming up with the information. But what convinced Hodgson was in 1892. One of the members of the Society for Psychical Research, George Pellew, Pellew, died. He was a journalist for the New York Sun. Also he had been a lawyer, and then he became a journalist and the editorial writer for the New York Sun. But anyway, he died in a fall down a flight of stairs. About a month after his death, he began communicating through Mrs. Piper with Hodgson, and then Hodgson went out and brought a number of people who knew Pellew into a sitting with Mrs. Piper. Now, he didn't tell Mrs. Piper that I'm bringing friends of George Pellew. He would just bring these people. I mean, it was a very controlled situation. In fact, usually he would have her go into a trance before he even brought anybody into a room. He would not give any names. And then Pellew, recognizing the people that Hodgson came in, would be give them very evidential information, or recall things that they did in the past, and recall names and of other people who worked for him, and little tidbits that really meant nothing but to anybody else, but they were very evidential to the people sitting with Mrs. Piper. One of them, Hodgson brought. What was the name? I think the last name is Hart, or that was at least the pseudonym that Hodgson gave him. A lot of these people didn't want their names, actual names given, so he gave them pseudonyms. And he mentioned that he had a discussion with their daughter Catherine about God, the afterlife and some other subject I forget, and they knew nothing about it.
They didn't know anything about that conversation.
Didn't know. When he got home, they asked their daughter, "Oh yes, I talked to Mr. Palou about that. Last time I saw him." But again, the theory then was that at least William James saw it as some kind of super psi or super ESP, whichever name you want to give to it.
Because Lenora Piper didn't know she was supposed to say those things. She didn't know who her audience was either. Yeah,
Right.
that would have been a part. Could have, for all she knew, it could have been a group that knew somebody else that she was supposed to be talking about.
Right. Yeah. And over a period of several years, that Hodgson was investigating her, he brought in like 150 people, 30 of which knew George Palou. And of those 30, Palou, speaking through Mrs. Piper, recognized all of them, brought their names up high out of them. Yeah. And of the other 120, he didn't know their names. So that in itself, the non-recognition, I mean, if she was telepathically reading their minds, she would have known the names of all of them.
Yeah, exactly. Now she got first and last names for all 30 that knew George Palou.
She didn't always get last names. She usually got the first name. It's...
And she didn't get George, Fred,
Right.
She got it the first time.
Those that are documented, she got, well, I don't know about the first time. I mean, she sometimes stumbled with names. It was hard to, what the problem is that let me back up a little bit. When in Mrs. Piper's case, when, her spirit body would leave her body and then George Palou would take over, he still had to use her brain and somehow get the information through her brain. And her brain couldn't always grasp the name, but usually with a little work at it, the name would come through.
But I'm trying to eliminate, the cold reading. Tell the audience, if we've talked about this in previous shows, but not everybody may be listening. What is cold reading, and how do we separate that out from genuine mediumship?
Well, cold reading usually has to do with clairvoyant type mediumship, not with trans mediumship, as Mrs. Piper displayed. But
fishing, in other words, could she have been fishing to these banks?
Yeah. William James saw there's a lot of fishing, but what there's 4 people involved. You got Leonora Piper. You got the person sitting there with her trying to get information from the spirit world. Then you've got George Palou, who's sort of the medium on the other side. And then you've got the communicating spirit. So there's often a breakdown between the communicating spirit and what George Palou trying to get the information from the communicating spirit, get it through Mrs. Piper's mind, to the person sitting there. So the 4 people there, and there are a lot of distortions. Often what would happen is that George Palou wouldn't understand what the spirit was saying. I mean, people wonder, well, he's sitting there right, with the other spirits on the other side, but it doesn't work that way. I mean, we don't know really how it works, but he has a hard time getting the messages, whatever the person is trying to say. He's trying to interpret, get it through Mrs. Piper's mind, and onto the sitter. And
sort of like people all speak, like they all speak different languages, and they're trying to translate into Spanish and then trying to translate into German, and then
right. Yeah. So as Palou on the other side, the medium on the other side was trying to figure out what the person was saying, it appeared that Mrs. Piper was fishing. She wasn't fishing. The Palou was fishing, trying to figure out what the spirit was trying to tell him.
And you talk about Bosch. I've never heard that term before, but in your book, is that what we're talking about here? What is Bosch?
Bosch? No, that was just, that was William James's term for humbug. I mean, it's just a bunch of, I think that was what they say. Today we just say it's a bunch of baloney, but when you're, back in that, at that time, it was just Bosch or humbug.
Okay, so if it's not genuine at all, that's Bosch, in other words. But
right.
What we're talking about now is kind of trying to get the lines of communication working properly.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's see, if you can remember, what are some of the other, some of the strongest evidence that Leonora Piper was able to come through with?
Well, Palou was probably the strongest, and right off the top of my head, I'm trying to think of the names. Benny Judah was a young boy who was killed in a boating accident at age 17. His father was a lawyer in Chicago, and the first time his father sat with him, Benny communicated to this. I can't give you off the top of my head the evidential information he came through, but there's no doubt in his father's mind that this was Benny communicating, because there were so many facts that he gave that,
Something about I just read this in your book, or something about riding out west. Wasn't there a horse ride or something?
Right. That was one of the things Benny mentioned, riding. He had gone on a trip to Wyoming or someplace with his friend and was riding a horse. So that was one of the things that came through. But anyway, this went on for something like 25 or 30 sittings that Mr. Judah, the lawyer, had with Mrs. Piper, and those were documented in one of the chapters of my book. But there was just so much evidential information. I mean, the researchers at that time said, Mrs. Piper must have been, had a private investigator working for her or whatever. Well, I would think
The other explanations aren't working now, so now we've got to accuse her of hiring an investigator.
Right.
Yeah. The objections change depending on, depending on what the evidence is. Yeah.
Right. One of the actually Richard Hodgson died in 1905, and the primary investigator for the American Society for Psychical Research at that time became Professor James Hislop, who was a professor of logic and ethics at Columbia University, and he sat with her a number of years earlier. His father communicated, his brother communicated, and he grew up in Ohio. So for a private investigator to go back to Ohio, let me back up and say that Mrs. Piper didn't know that Hislop was going to be there. He was brought anonymously. So, how do you do an investigation on somebody in Ohio that you don't even know is, going to be sitting with you?
So what was Professor Hyslop's, what was his conclusion about her?
Oh, yeah, no doubt. I mean, no doubt that, Hislop, was certain that she was a genuine medium, and he had dozens of sittings with her from 1905 to 1910. Somewhere around 1910, her mediumship began to decline, and she was never the same. That's one of the things that a lot of mediums went through. They had their good years, and then I guess it's like athletic ability to some extent. You begin to burn out on it, and it doesn't work as well after a number of years.
Now this Noah Hyslop, he's a professor of logic and ethics. Is that right?
Right.
So my question is, who are you going to believe? And to put it crassly, who better to judge the logic of the situation and the ethics of the situation than a professor of logic and ethics? So it can strike me the credentials of these people who are starting out as skeptics and studying these phenomena. I think it's important to bear in mind, who it is that we're talking about here.
Right. I mean, there were a number of esteemed scientists and scholars. Sir Oliver Lodge was one of a world famous physicist at the time. He sat with Mrs. Piper on a number of occasions. He concluded that she was real. He heard from a number of deceased relatives. There was no doubt in his mind. Lodge was one of the pioneers of electricity and the radio. In fact, they say he beat Marconi to the inventing the wireless, but he didn't get around to patenting it because he was so involved with psychical research. He just sort of set it aside, and then Marconi, got the patent on it and got all the credit for it. But Lodge was really the guy who invented it.
Isn't it true, we're moving too far ahead now, but just briefly, isn't it? I have heard that Thomas Edison was working on equipment to talk to people on the other side at the time that he died. Is that correct, to your knowledge?
That's what I've read, but I don't think he really got anywhere with it. I don't know much more than the fact that he was working on some equipment trying to enter that.
But I think the point is that these extremely bright people involved in the cutting edge science, they took it seriously.
definitely.
Yeah. So who else is around? We're back in the 19th century. Who else is around now besides Leonora and some of the people we've already talked about?
Well, as I said, Hume was probably the foremost physical medium. Leonora Piper was the trans medium, but there were dozens of mediums, but these were the two mediums that most of the research was done with. There really was not that much research done with other mediums, at least that have been documented before 1900. Much more of it was after 1900. Gladys Osborne Leonard was called the Leonora Piper of England. She was investigated thoroughly by the Society for Psychical Research between around 1914 and 1925, and Leonora Piper and Gladys Osborne Leonard are the two big ones. Eileen Garrett also was another well-known trans medium.
Oh, I heard. Yeah, tell me. I heard
something. She was born in Ireland and came to the United States. In her early 20s, I think it was. But again, I can't recall, specifically the cases, but it was much like Leonora Piper and Gladys Osborne Leonard. She'd go into a trance and spirits would communicate with her. One of the more famous cases involved with her was called the R101. No, I forget. It was a blimp, a dirigible that went down in 1930. I can't remember if it was R101 or 104 or whatever it was, but she was shortly after the dirigible crashed. She began receiving messages from the pilot of the dirigible, explaining exactly what went wrong, what happened. But people the skeptics seem to feel that somehow she dug up this information from various sources.
The same investigator from the that went out to Ohio now went out to the wreck.
Right. Yeah.
You can't take this stuff seriously. I'm sorry, it's awful. But who knows? Sometimes you can be surprised. You can make assumptions and you can fool yourself and realize that there was a normal explanation for things. It does happen, but it doesn't always happen.
Right.
That you find there was a normal explanation, that you're fooling yourself. Not always. And there's this a priori assumption by the skeptics that it can't possibly be, so there must be a normal explanation. And therefore they will fish as hard as they have to fish until they come up with something, even if it's not rational, which drives them. Right.
Can I tell you about my own little experience with a medium? This is a clairvoyant type medium. In 1999, actually, this is what, as I mentioned, I started with reincarnation and near-death experiences. In 1999, I was in London and was walking around outside of my hotel. My wife and I went for a walk, and we came to the Spiritualist Association of Great Britain, which was in Belgrave Square, not far from a hotel. And I had never heard of it before. We decided to walk in and see what it was all about. It was about 2:00 in the afternoon, and after we got in, we noticed that they have clairvoyant readings at 3:00 and 6:00 every day. So it was almost 3:00. We decided to wait around and get a reading. It was like, I think, 6 British pounds was about $10 US per person. And we went into a room, and there were about 15 people there. The clairvoyant walks in and goes up on a stage in front of us, and she closes her eyes, and then she points to a person in the group and says, I'm getting someone named James here that's telling me that he's your deceased husband and so forth. And people were nodding, and she was going around the room, and they were all nodding and seemed to acknowledge they know what she was talking about. And then she comes to my wife and says, I've got somebody here who he's a father figure, but he's not your father. I think he might be your uncle. He's telling me his name is George, and he's saying that there's a family joke that you look more like him than your father, which really hit. My wife was very skeptical at the time, but that really hit home. I mean, there was a family joke. Her Uncle George, her mother had said that, Gina, my wife, looks much more like her Uncle George than her father. And so that was sort of a family joke, and it was true. But how do you research something like that? I mean,
I was going to say, wait, what the heck of a detective to scare that?
yeah. But then she said she said you've got an older woman there that could be a grandmother figure, and that the woman was telling her that my wife forgot her mother's birthday, her past birthday, which, as I recall, we left like 3 days before her birthday or something like that, and she forgot her mother's birthday, which she actually did. Yeah. Then she comes to me and she says, "I've got a George for you too, but he's not coming through very well. I'm not getting much from him. And I try to think what George would come through. I felt that somebody was going to come through. It might be my deceased brother or a good friend that died a year or two before. But I couldn't figure out who George was. I just shook my head. I said, I don't know who that is. And she tried to get more. Nothing. She couldn't get it, and she finally gave up on me. But so I went away that night thinking I was the only failure. Everybody else seemed very happy with the information they got. We drove around England, drove her up to Scotland, came back to London. About 10 days later, I decided to go back. So I went back, paid my £6, went into the room. There's another clairvoyant, totally different woman, elderly lady, about 85, with a walker. She'd come up. She was up in front of the group, and she was even better than the first one as far as the other people were concerned. She comes to me and she says, "There's somebody standing right behind you with his hands on his shoulders, and he's telling me his name is George." So I shook my head. I don't know who that is. And she closes her eyes. She said, "He's telling me he's a former colleague, and he passed into spirit about 20 years ago, and he died of a blood-related disease, and he's very happy that you have a job now that you like. He said he's been around you in your office, and he knows you like your job." Well, it just didn't ring any bell with me at the time. Yeah, and I'm sorry, I don't know who that is. And all of a sudden, about an hour after, no, not even an hour, maybe 20 minutes after I left the place, it dawned on me that this person, George, was somebody who worked with me in 1979. He wasn't a good friend, so I wasn't expecting, him to come through. I hadn't thought about him for a number of years. And it dawned on me, George, I used to go to coffee with him about twice a week. He knew I hated the job. It was a job that I shouldn't have taken in the first place, but I didn't like the job. And I used to talk to him about it. I wasn't sure what he had died. He died after I left the company. I left the company, and he died about a year after I left the company. I couldn't remember what he died of. When I got home, I called a friend and said, "What did George die of?" And it turned out he died of leukemia, which is a, quote, blood-related disease. Now,
So she's hit colleagues, she's hit names, she's hit the means of death. She's hit the fact that about the job and not liking the job. So that's at least 4 that I'm counting as your.
yeah.
And it's 2 mediums, and it's 2 separate.
Yeah. Of course, the people, the skeptic will say, "Why didn't she just give his last name?" I don't want to, say his last name here because,
Right.
his widow or relatives, they might not appreciate that.
What do you say to that skeptical question? Why couldn't she just make it easy and say the last thing?
Because they're getting symbols for the most part. They're getting picture that they have to interpret as, you might get George. They have a picture. John Edward once said that, if he gets the name George, he sees a picture of St. George in his mind.
I see. Okay.
And, I don't know how she got George, but anyway, George is, is a common name that she could get some symbol for it, but there was no symbol for his last name. Yeah, she could get, so she couldn't get his last name. As far as leukemia, why couldn't she get the word leukemia? She sees a body with blood circulating through it or something, and there's a blood-related disease. She doesn't get the word leukemia.
Now that's the clairvoyant one. There's also clairaudient ones. I'm gonna share a quick little story here. There's a fellow that I hired as part of research, past life research. and I was interested in two people, and the woman's name was Abby, and the man's name was Matthew. So these are the people I was interested in. And he was a psychic artist, really. I mean, that was, and he was Lilydale certified, came well recommended. So he starts up, and he got 4 names in the course of an hour. And one of them made perfect sense the way he said it. John around her, which he had a brother who I think was quite dominant, so that would name John. So that made sense. Then he got Henry, which didn't make any sense until later in the research. I found that it made perfect sense, but it didn't make any sense at the time. Another name that sounded like it might have been her family name or something that he didn't quite get right. And then toward the end of the reading, it was like he was struggling. He says, "I hear M Matthew." He got out his name flat out, but first he heard M. So apparently it's like the connection isn't real good. It's like dealing with somebody that's got an ear trumpet and So yeah, right.
Yeah, and that it's the same thing when I was talking about George Plou and with Mrs. Piper. They're not getting words from the communicating spirit. They're getting symbols or pictures or whatever, and
When like I'm feeling pressure on my head or something, I hear
right. And so they have to interpret that, and that's where the so-called fishing comes in. But the skeptics, they see that as the medium fishing for information. I mean, and this is as I said, happens so much with the clairvoyants that they're trying to figure out, what am I seeing here? What am I, there's a grandfather, father, brother, uncle. I mean, they're seeing a level higher than the person, but they're not sure that it's the father or the uncle. And then, they'll say father and no, not my father, or uncle next, and then the skeptic will say that, well, that's fishing. That's just fishing for information, cold reading. And that's how she got it. She just eliminated the number of people before she got to it.
And do you know one person that I've studied is Arthur Ford, and I found out there's a really interesting little tidbit in there that he learned his trance technique from Paramahansa Yogananda when he was young, from a young Paramahansa Yogananda. Can you talk some about Arthur Ford? Are you familiar with him?
Yeah, I am familiar. In fact, as I'm sitting here in my little library, I have about 4 or 5 of his books in front of me, but it's been so long since I read them that I can't recall specific details about art.
I know there's a trance medium, right?
He was a trance medium, yeah, and he was another one that there was some question as to whether he was, whether he reverted to fraud or not. I don't recall the exact.
Well, he struggled with alcoholism. I think he had a car wreck and he was on painkillers, and then he went to alcohol. So he had some struggles, personal struggles.
Right. Yeah, in fact, the book right in front of me on my bookcase, they Knew the Unknown by Arthur Ford, I think is the one I'm looking at here. But I can't give you a detail. It's been so long since I read about it.
Do you remember, and then if you don't, it's fine, we'll just move on, but there was a case with Harry Houdini that after Houdini passed, and he was brought in to read for Houdini's wife?
Yeah, and there was a word that Houdini left with his wife that he said if he could communicate after he died, he would get that word through. And somehow, I don't remember.
Yeah.
The word came through, but there's some skeptical take on it that he didn't get it right or whatever.
What I understand, I'll fill in what I remember from reading on one person's interpretation who wasn't skeptical, was that the phrase was Beatrice belief, and that it was in the code that they used in their act. And then Ford gave it in the code that they'd used in their act. He gave the keywords. But the skeptics had found that some years previous, that Houdini had published the code. And therefore, on that basis, they decided that it was debunked. But they never explained how he was able to get the phrase and the keywords in the first place. That's my understanding of that. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. So it wasn't actually debunked. I mean, theoretically, he could have read the book, in other words, but and gotten the code. But let's suppose that he hadn't. Is pretty amazing. Yeah. So, yeah, that's a pretty interesting case.
Yeah, the skeptics have an answer, and I shouldn't say the skeptics, the pseudo skeptics.
I mean, skepticism is in tradition. Yeah.
Right.
But the cynics, well, I call the cynics what you call the pseudo skeptics. I think they always have an answer, and it's an escalating answer. In other words, if this answer doesn't work, they come up with the next level of answer. And like the guy sent an investigator out to Ohio, not knowing who he was even investigating.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Stuff like that. Yeah.
But I mean, the other end, even if you send an investigator to Ohio, I mean, some of this information, is so far-fetched, so, not documented, just coming from their memories. I mean, how do you research it?
Yeah. No, I don't see personally any way that it could all be fraudulent. I don't see how that position is tenable. But having experienced myself, evidential readings and, like for example, the one that I talked about where the guy got the name Matthew at the end, theoretically, he could have been on the internet on his laptop. Right. Looked up my name, found what I was interested in, figured out who I was talking about and fed it back to me. But I tried to trace that as far as I could. Since he was Lilydale certified, I wrote Lilydale, can you tell me what your, ethics training is? And never could get an answer. But I got an answer from one of his colleagues who says that, yes, I know him and can vouch for him and, so forth and so on. But, and then I did what everybody can do on the internet, go up and see if people are complaining, because nowadays the internet's very powerful. If somebody's fraudulent, you're going to get, you're going to find out. If the restaurant is serving with flies in the food, you're going to find out, on the internet nowadays. And he didn't have a single complaint. He had people glowing, reports, but he didn't have a single complaint. Nobody was charging him with anything, So, I would have to be going into a extreme stance to believe that this man deliberately got on his laptop while we were talking and committed blatant fraud to get me that name. But
Right.
it just doesn't, I mean, you could go there if you really want. You can always go somewhere. You can always find some way to wiggle out of it, but it really wouldn't be rational to accuse the man of that. There's no reason to accuse him of that. And if I don't accuse him of that, he nailed it. It's like due liability. Yeah.
Well, with my George situation in 1999, the internet was around, but not to the extent it is now. So a couple of people, I told a story to a couple of people, and they researched it. They put your name into a Google search, but there's that here. Google wasn't around then. But the fact is, nobody asked for my name. I didn't sign up for anything. I paid my £6 and went in. No names were given.
No names were given, and that was so obscure you couldn't even remember it yourself. And two different mediums, guy. I mean, it's a very interesting. That's a lot more powerful than it sounds. Your little story there, when you really sit down and look at, what are the possible explanations? There are no explanations for that. Very interesting to me, that I can think of, as we're talking anyway.
Yeah, and they didn't know I was coming back. I just, took my chances and after I driving around England for 10 days, went back and unannounced, no name given again. And the second medium also gets George.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Now I've got a list of names of people. If you're not familiar with, they don't have to be people if they happen to be people you haven't studied, we'll just move on. But Allan Kardec, I think, is in the 1800s and is a big.
Yeah, he was more the spiraling type than the evidential type. In fact, if you read, he's got 5 or 6 books that he wrote, and I'm looking at those right in front of me also. But very little in the way of evidential. It's all wisdom and knowledge that came through the medium.
We don't know what his background was in terms of, was he like, well,
he was an educator of some kind. He owned a boys' school. He trained to be a teacher, but ended up being a full-time psychical researcher. And the whole philosophy of Spiritism is based upon Kardec's teaching, which is very big in Brazil at this time.
That's what I understand.
Yeah, I forget how many millions of people practice Spiritism in Brazil, but it's like 1/3 of the population, I think.
One of the people I hope to have on here is a woman who's an assistant to John of God. Are you familiar with that fellow in Brazil?
Oh yeah. I've heard of a number of people who visit John of God. I have a friend who's a brain surgeon here in Hawaii that went down to visit John of God last year and came back cured of 3 different problems. He had a foot problem. He had diabetes, and I forget what the third problem was, but he came back cured of all of them. And this
Does John of God does he give like medical advice, or does he actually literally perform cures on the spot?
he performs cures on the spot. I've seen videos of him, and he will actually do surgery right in front of, right on the person there. But some of them, he just puts his hands on the person, from what I understand, and sends some healing energy into the person. And it's not always an instant thing, and it doesn't always work. I don't know what the success rate is. I think it's less than 50%, but it does work with, a fair percentage of people.
That's probably better. That's probably better than you get at the hospital, though.
Right. Well, I mean, Lourdes is supposed to be much less than 5%, I think.
Exactly. So IFD is pretty darn good. Yeah. Yeah. Of course, he has like a number of physicians who have passed on and were on the other side who are helping him. Is that right? That's what
that's what I'm told happens, that he's got physicians diagnosing these people and telling him what to do in the surgery and so forth.
So it's not necessary that just because you've crossed over, like the convenience store clerk is automatically like a brilliant surgeon as soon as he crosses over. It's not that. He's got people who are specialists, helping him there. So it's like he has a group of 50 world-class, physicians, helping advise him there in the room, sort of. Well, it sounds like to me, yeah. Let's go back to these organizations, how they got founded and what they attempted to do and what became of them.
Mm. Well, the Society for Psychical Research, the SPR, as it's usually called, that was formed in 1882, and that was primarily because of the loss of faith in the world at the time. Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species was published in 1859, and between that time and 1880, many educated people just gave up their religion. They felt that, if the whole story in the Bible about how the world was created was wrong, then the whole Bible must be wrong, and there must be no God. So it was really a time of despair. During the 1870s, Frederick Myers, who was one of the founders of the SPR, wrote that it was a time of despair. William James himself said he was in such despair that he considered committing suicide when he was in medical school. So the Society for Psychical Research were formed to see if there was anything to these spirit manifestations that they had heard about. They didn't come right out and say, we're looking for evidence of life after death, because they would have been the mainstream scientific community would have scoffed at them. So they said, we're looking for, to see if there's anything to mental telepathy and other forms of ESP. But really, reading between the lines, their goal was to find out whether or not there was a spirit world, and whether spirits of the dead could communicate with people. So 1882 is when it all began, and then Sir William Barrett, who was one of the in fact, he's the one that really recommended that the SPR be formed. He was on a trip to the United States, met with William James in Boston, and encouraged him to establish the American branch of the Society for Psychical Research, and that was 1885, as I recall, or late 1884, and so the 3 years later. Yeah. So those two organizations, dedicated themselves to scientific research, controlled scientific research, had numerous esteemed people, besides Sir Oliver Lodge, who I mentioned, Dr. Charles Richet, who was a French professor of chemistry and a Nobel Prize winner, was very much involved in psychical research, and there were a number of other esteemed scientists and scholars part of those organizations. The SPR still exists today, at least the London one. The American branch is, from what I understand, still exists, but is not very active. But the SPR in London still exists today.
So the real credentials for being in this group were courage. Professional courage, yeah.
Right.
Because you knew you were going to come under fire, basically, if you aligned yourself with these people.
Definitely.
Oh, yeah. Now, one interesting thing you said is the impact that Charles Darwin's theories had. And yet we had Alfred Russel Wallace, who was working on very much the same thing, and he had
a much less materialistic take on evolution. This was brought to my attention by a monk of the Ramakrishna order who told me about Alfred Russel Wallace, and his comment was that the publishers went with Charles Darwin, and that's why we know of evolution through Charles Darwin. But just as easily, we could have known of a much more spiritual friendly version through Alfred Russel Wallace. Can you comment on why one of those guys, succeeded and one of them is now so obscure that nobody's ever heard of him?
Yeah, well, to begin with, we go back the year before On the Origin of the Species was published. The whole theory of evolution was announced. I can't remember the name of the group in London at the time, but it was announced as having neither Darwin nor Wallace was there at the time, but their papers were read by somebody. So that was the whole beginning of the whole theory of evolution, how it came to the public's attention, but it didn't really become well known until Darwin wrote his book. I mean, Darwin and Wallace were not working together. Wallace was off down in New Guinea or someplace exploring the jungles, and when Wallace was writing his book, so Darwin gets all the credit, and perhaps rightfully so, because I think he was really, investigating before Wallace started looking into this whole thing. But somewhere around 1865, Wallace decided he was going to investigate mediums. This was 6 years later. He was a hardcore materialist at the time, but after he sat with several mediums, he became to believe in mediumship. But again, he was dismissed by mainstream scientists as having been, duped by a bunch of mediums. And the more he attempted to make his research known in the area of mediumship, the more he was laughed at. And at some point in time, he just became an outcast from science.
So he became marginalized, basically, because he
Right.
persisted in that. That's very, yeah. I mean, the whole pattern is so clear to me. Then there's no good scientist that believes in it, because as soon as you believe in it, you're not a good scientist. It's certainly a lot. Right. What or who have we missed in this story? That, I mean, of course, there's so many we can't talk about, but we've touched on Andrew Jackson Davis, who I guess was the spiraling type, as you said. What have we missed in here that you think might be important to talk about?
Well, one of my favorite stories has to do with Professor Neville Wymant. He was a linguist who taught at Oxford and Tokyo University. He said to have been conversant in 30 languages, including 3 dialects of Chinese and Japanese, and he was in the United States.
We should say that's 30. I mean, when you think,
Right, 30 languages he was conversant in, and he was in the United States in 1926, I think it was, studying the language of various the American Indians. And he was in New York, and he was invited to the home of Judge William Cannon, he was a prominent New York judge at the time. And Judge Cannon and his wife, I think his wife was primarily the one interested in it, were conducting or having a medium named George Valentine over to their house, and having séances at their house. So at one of the séances, somebody started, or Valentine, let me go back up and say that Valentine was a direct voice medium, which is a little bit different from trance mediums. In the direct voice, you get an ectoplasmic voice box formed by the spirit, and they usually speak through it's amplified by a trumpet. You've probably seen these floating around. So they're not coming through the mouth of the medium, they're coming through the trumpet. And so there was quite a bit of evidential information coming through George Valentine. He was not in a trance. He was just sitting there, and sometimes he'd be talking to the person next to him when the voices were coming through. But in this one sitting, some voice started coming through in what appeared to be Chinese to the sitters. Heard about about Professor Wyman being in New York at the time, and she asked him if he could attend or come to their house for dinner. She didn't tell him what it was for. So anyway, Wyman accepted the invitation, not realizing what he was in for. She felt if she told him what it was all about, he might decline. Right. Yeah. So after he got there, they told him it was explained to him what was going on. So he graciously accepted. So after dinner, they sat around with a group. I don't know how many people were there, 10 or 12 or whatever, sat in a group with Valentine there, and voices started coming through the megaphone, and one came to Mrs. Wyman, the professor's wife, and in a very English accent, and she spoke with her father, and it turned out to be, it was clear to her and to Professor Wyman that it was her father speaking. However, Wyman was still he was very skeptical at the time. He thought something must be going on. He couldn't figure out what was going on, but something strange was going on. And after a number of other people in the group heard from deceased relatives or friends, he started hearing this Chinese voice, and he began communicating in Chinese, but it was an ancient Chinese dialect that he couldn't quite understand. And he asked in Chinese for the person to identify himself. Well, the person gave, I don't remember the name now, but anyway, it was Confucius speaking, but he gave his actual name. Wyman was a scholar in Confucius literature, so he started quizzing Confucius on some of his writings, and he got accurate responses. There was one thing that had confused scholars for a number of years, and Wyman asked about it, and the confusion was explained to him why, because something was mistranslated. Anyway, Wyman came away convinced that that George Valentine was not a fraud. He was, he couldn't figure out what was going on. So he came back.
They would call this disembodied responsive xenoglossy.
Yeah. Whatever name I want to give it was your. But anyway, he came back 10 or 11 times. After that, he conversed with spirits in 11 different languages, including Greek and Japanese and Hebrew and whatever. But then, after he left New York, he went back to England, where he was from, and saw Sir Oliver Lodge, told Sir Oliver Lodge about it. Lodge arranged for the SPR to investigate Valentine. They had Valentine come over to London. No, it was in New York or London. I don't remember if it was New York or London. But anyway, they didn't get very good results in New York or London, and one of the researchers concluded that probably Valentine learned a few words of Chinese and was able to dupe Professor Wyman. And they just wrote off Valentine as, being a fraud. Again, this is the SPR. They had their good investigators and their skeptical investigators.
It just logically, that just doesn't cut it as an explanation. If it, as you described it to me, we're talking 10 different languages, responsive, insightful,
Right.
Yeah, if not possible, it just doesn't. It's not even relevant, that explanation. And this was when? It's before any recording equipment, is that right? I mean, we don't have record players and.
Yeah, they actually did record some of it, and some of it is still on record, I think, in the SPR files, but it's very difficult it was so not of a good quality and difficult.
Well, the point is, he couldn't have been playing anything in the room, right?
Oh, no.
That kind of machine. Yeah, at that time. In one of the days,
1926, I think it was, October 1926. One of the other things was that Wyman would give the first line of one of Confucius's poem, and the voice would repeat the next 14 lines.
Yes. Okay.
Poems. Now, if I was to say that Valentine learned all of Confucius's poems, learned an ancient dialect of Chinese, learned 14 other languages. And this guy was a simple, uneducated American.
This is what I'm talking about when I talk about the little professor. In order to put forth that explanation, that's the little professor who says that, I didn't eat the cookies, the crumbs got on my mouth because of, the monster that came and put them there or something. It's just irrational,
Right.
which fascinates me. Can't they see that they're being irrational? But apparently irrational people cannot see that they're being irrational or something, and these are presumably educated people who are coming out at things that are on the level of the dog ate my homework. But the sociological and psychological aspects of skepticism fascinate me, always have fascinated me, to watch people go into denial, and really believe that they're not going into denial. It's fascinating. It's just fascinating to me. Anyway, yeah. Mike, thank you. We could go on and on with this, but tell us now how they can find your books, if you have a website, how they can find your information.
Well, no, it's just a matter of going to Amazon.com and looking under my name, Michael Tymn, Tymn. It can be found. I'm at my blog is at White Crow Books. But the Leonora Piper book is the latest one. The most popular one seems to be The Afterlife Revealed, in which I've done a lot of, it's more of the spiraling type mediumship of spirits reporting what the afterlife is like. Just Amazon.com, put my name in, and they'll come up. I don't know if I was going to conclude here with people ask, well, why after 100 years don't we have convincing evidence? Why in spite of the skepticism, why is not all this better known to the public? And back in 1852, I think it was, Victor Hugo, the great author, was sitting with a medium, and he asked the communicating spirit, who claimed to be Martin Luther, why God doesn't better reveal himself. And the message he got back from Martin Luther, I'll quote here: "Because doubt is the instrument which forges the human spirit. If the day were to come when the human spirit no longer doubted, the human soul would fly off and leave the plow behind, for it would have acquired wings. The earth would lie fallow. Now God is the sower and man is the harvester. The celestial seed demands that the human plowshare remain in the furrow of life." So in effect, what Martin Luther was saying is that doubt, is part of the divine plan. I think if we knew,
But this issue is in school. Kids who think or die here in school, where we need to have experiences. It's a beautiful answer, by the way.
well,
That's interesting, because I have always felt that, if I could just convince everybody, that would solve it, but it may not be meant to be,
right.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Well, Mike, thank you for a very interesting discussion. I hope that people that haven't really looked too much into this subject will now be stimulated to look into it some more.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate. Thank you very much for having me on, Steve.
Okay, have a good evening.
Yeah, same to you. Bye now.
Okay, bye-bye.